Architecture of ancient Rome. Again, rinse and repeat. You're going to hear this a lot. Borrowed heavily from the Greeks. That seems to be Rome's MO, is to borrow from other cultures and make it their own. However, they do have some developments that can be distinctly pointed to as Roman innovations, particularly the arch, the barrel vault, the cross vault, and the dome. These are all things that we'll get to as we go through the lecture. They also had some advances in civic engineering that sadly would get lost and would have to be sort of reincorporated, rediscovered how these things were done. Like concrete. The Romans invented the first concrete and used it in a lot of their architecture. Aqueducts. These were structures that were made to bring water to cities. And as such, they also had indoor plumbing and very large walls that would cover miles and miles of terrain. We'll look at one in particular, Hadrian's Wall, in a moment. All right, so move this over here. So a big innovation of the ancient Romans was what is referred to as the Roman arch. It is what you see right here. The Romans realized that if you stack a number of stones that have been cut in a very specific way, right, to where they're angled inward like so, that once you put this last stone in right here, this very top stone, which is referred to as the keystone, that once you put that in place, this is now a stable structure. This arch will hold itself up. Right? And that was a big advancement over the post and lintel construction of the Greeks. Right? This allowed for them to have a rounded ceiling, rounded entrances, and aesthetically, that's nice, but it also allowed for them to have larger structures than the Greeks had been able to get. Because this arch is also quite a bit stronger than the post and lintel construction method. All right, then they realized, all right, you take an arch, and you just keep lining up arch after arch after arch after arch, and you can get what is referred to as a barrel vault. It's like a tunnel made up of arches. Right? And that is a nice, strong, sturdy structure. Then they realized if you intersect two barrel vaults, you can get what is referred to as a cross vault, and this is what can then allow for much larger, much more open interior spaces. Right? You can line up several cross vaults in a row, and you can have a larger space. Then, a big, big advancement is to take this idea of the arch and say, all right, take that arch and spin it 360 degrees, right? Zoom, and you get a dome. The Romans were the first culture to, on an architectural level at least, create constructed domes. And they did so usually by placing that arch on top of what was referred to as a drum. Right? This then could handle a lot of the weight that was being passed down through the sides of that arch. All right, but as I said, a lot of Roman architecture is borrowing, you might even say ripping off cultures that came before them. This is the Maison Carrée in France, because again, the Romans went out and conquered, so they had this area of France. And this piece is a culmination of lots of different cultures. So first off, we see portions of this that are Etruscan. Let me move myself down here. I think that will be a good spot. For instance, there's I guess I didn't put myself in the right spot. The whole thing is built on a raised platform. That's very Etruscan. There is the central stairway leading up to the front entrance, which is Etruscan. And a deep front porch, or portico, which is also very Etruscan. These are all things that were incorporated from them, as well as what are called engaged columns. I'm going to dive into that more in depth in a moment. From the Greeks, when we look at this piece, we see that Greek pediment. You should be very familiar with that by now. We see some Corinthian columns. Boy, the Romans loved the Corinthian architectural order, by the way. You're going to see, if you look at ancient Roman architecture, a lot of it's going to incorporate the Corinthian architectural order. So here they are stealing that. And the Greek ratios. They built this temple on the same kind of ratios that the Greeks thought were perfection. So when I say engaged columns, that's an important term that I want you to keep in mind. Let me move my video there's no good place. I'll just put it up there. Engaged columns are when a column is not freestanding, but it's not completely and utterly incorporated into the wall either. Usually about 2/3 of the column protrudes outward from the wall, and about 1/3 of it is still incorporated into the wall itself. All right? That's an engaged column, right? When the column and the wall are built together, but the column itself protrudes out quite a bit, but it's just not a full column in the round. This was something that the Etruscans used, and the Romans would incorporate into their work as well. Then we look at the Pantheon, built in Rome, in the city of Rome, in 126 CE. And if you don't see Greek influence there, then you're not paying attention. The Pantheon was built under Emperor Hadrian, and like I said, it combines the Greek designs, particularly that front piece, right, where you see the pediment, you see those Corinthian columns, right? I mean, the front of that thing just looks so much like the Parthenon, right? But it combines those Greek elements with Roman design innovations, particularly, although it's hard to see in this particular photograph, the Roman innovation of a dome sitting atop a drum. If you walk inside, you really get a feel for the extent of this dome. The dome on top of the Pantheon, which again was a temple that was built to honor all of the gods, and the Romans imported all of their gods from the Greeks and then tweaked them and changed them a bit. This dome has a diameter of 144 feet and a height of 72 feet, making it still to this day the largest freestanding concrete dome on the planet. Right? The sheer technical ability it took to design and construct something like this is mind-boggling. Everything that you see here is original to the Romans. There's this multicolored marble floor down here that's still intact. There's the dome itself has all these little recessed panels. Right, these are referred to as coffers, and they are one of the big design elements that allowed them to build this, because this keeps the weight of the arch from becoming, the dome from becoming too heavy. All these little coffers. As well as up here is what is referred to as the oculus. This allows light and the elements, rain, but those things would be allowed to come in through that hole in the top. And that in itself also manages to make the whole dome a bit lighter and not quite so heavy, so it can stand up better. We see on display the Roman love of decoration. We have inside here all of these alcoves, these little alcoves that have been put in here that are made to look like frames. There would have been statues of different gods and goddesses up in there. We can see again the Corinthian pillars holding up everything down here. The columns themselves, many of the columns are just decorative. They don't seem to actually be holding things up. And these pediments, right? These pediments aren't architectural. They're just decorative. They're just there, right? This is the Roman love of decoration, but also showing off just what they could do with the sort of leaps in engineering that they had developed. And in speaking of leaps in engineering, this would be one of the aqueducts we were talking about. This is the Pont du Gard in France, again, that would have been made somewhere in the late 1st century CE. Okay, aqueduct. Let me explain first. An aqueduct, the actual aqueduct itself is running along the top of this. It would have been a trench that would have carried water from some source, a lake, a river, some body of water, and using gravity and gravity alone would have transported that water to a city in need of water. But in this particular case, you need the water to get from a source that's on the other side of a river. So it needs a bridge to be constructed to get that aqueduct flowing from one side of this river to the other. And they did so through a series of arches. Right? Really large arches to hold the weight toward the bottom, and much smaller arches to hold up the aqueduct portion up here at the top. And the amazing thing is that those stones they use, in this case they're using stone, they're not using concrete for this particular piece. And it would have been done without any mortar. There's nothing in between the stones holding them together. This whole thing is being held together by gravity pressing down on these arches, and then the arches, because of the way the stones are cut and fit together, pushing back, right? So without any actual mortar, here it is thousands of years later, and the thing's still standing. And again, it would have operated by pure gravity. There'd have been some sort of a water source, right, like a mountain spring, a lake, something like that. That would have had an underground tunnel that water would have flown into. And in this case, we have the bridge, or what this is referred to as an arcade, because it is made up of arches, right? That continue the water across some chasm and until it reaches a distribution tower in the city. And there would have been outflows for uses for private homes, for outflow to baths, because bathing was a thing that the Greeks did, and the Romans adopted it because the Greeks did it. Right? Like taking baths was not a thing that all of Europe was doing necessarily at this time. And then another outflow that would go to like fountains and things like that. Because the higher up, right, the dirty crap that could be in the water is going to settle to the bottom, right? So best to send that to things we're not going to drink or bathe in. And then, yes, that water went into people's homes. Romans had indoor plumbing, which was a huge advancement. Another huge important piece of Roman architecture is the Colosseum. It was built between 72 and 80 CE. Was a sports arena that would have been used for gladiator battles, races, chariot battles, things of that nature. It was a big deal at the time to have entertainment for the people. The Roman emperors very quickly realized that they could garner a lot of political clout and a lot of popularity amongst the people if they provided entertainment, often increasingly violent entertainment. And the Colosseum became one way of accommodating very large crowds. It could hold tens of thousands of people. Well, how did they do that? Well, again, they ripped off the Greeks, right? They took the Greek amphitheater, they're just beneath the Acropolis, right? The amphitheater, the big arched seating that sort of led down to an open air stage, and they just doubled it. They just put another one over here, boom, right? So that now people can be on both sides and can watch it. But it was huge, right? At least for the time, this was huge. This, as I said, could have held tens of thousands of people to go and see spectator events. And there were a lot of engineering marvels that come into that as well. We'll get into in a moment here. The first thing I want to point out is how, again, the influence of the Greeks, the way the Greeks just stole their stuff from the Greeks, is very evident when we look at the outside of the Colosseum, which again is on this like four levels here that we see. And they each have, as you can see, the Roman arch, but then each of the Roman arches is flanked by columns, and those columns have the Greek architectural orders, and they ranked them by how they thought of them. All right, the Romans, as I said, really liked the Corinthian order, and so what did they put up here at the very top? There's the Corinthian order, right? They second in their mind was the Ionic order, and notice that on the second floor here we have Ionic columns, and the least desirable, the most plain and ordinary of the orders, the one that they didn't like all that much, was the Doric. And look, there's the Doric at the very bottom level of this whole thing. Now, the Colosseum is in ruins. It would not have looked like this in its heyday. Right, there would have been seating all up in here. We'll look at an example or an artist's rendering of it in a moment here. There would have been seating all up in here, and it was designed in such a way that people could get into the building and to their seats very quickly and very easily. Civil engineers to this day who work on arenas for sports and sports complexes and things of that nature still play around with some of these same ideas that the Romans came up with, because they wanted to be able to fill it quickly, and they wanted, when the show was over, for it to be able to empty very quickly, and they managed that. The floor of it, which is referred to as the arena, and here is another important thing that if you have been watching the lecture, this is an important thing that you'll get now that I'm not including in any of the notes. Arena is Latin being the language of the Romans, Latin for sand. So an arena, the stage floor of the Colosseum, would have been covered with sand, which is why to this day we refer to something like this as an arena. We're essentially just calling it sand. So this would have been covered with sand, and then underneath that floor, as you can see, there was a whole complex of places for storing the people, the props that would be needed for things. Oftentimes it'd be live animals, so you'd keep the live animals down there, and they could be brought up top. The gladiators could be down there preparing before going up and going into battle. There are even stories of this floor being flooded with water and boats coming in and having a battle with each other. It was crazy, right? But this is how it would have originally looked. All right, all those different levels of the Colosseum. You can see how people would have entered, would have climbed stairs, and look at how similar this is to this day when you go into any sort of an arena, right? Where you may be going to an event for a concert or a sporting event or what have you, right? This is kind of how it looks like to this day, where you've got a hallway that you go, right? If you go to a show today in 2020, when you went to a show in 2019, I guess we're not really going to shows so much in 2020, you'd have gone in. You'd have gone up to the floor you needed to have been on, and then you would have had like a hallway, right, that goes around the entire thing. And you'd have walked around until you got to the staircase that leads you into your specific section. That's what the Romans would have done. They'd have climbed up here, and then they would have gone into their seats, wherever their seat was. Again, there's the floor that would have been wood, then covered with sand, ergo arena, underneath which was all of the stuff for those who were going to be involved in whatever the event was, right? And then, up above, all around the perimeter, at the very top, that we know, though they have not survived, there were these rigs that were placed here to hold out these awnings to provide shade. Now, it would provide shade for some, others would sadly get scorched by the sun, but this little circle of sunlight that was allowed in would move depending on where the sun was. Over here we have where the emperor and his entourage would have sat. Then, as I mentioned, the northernmost position that the Roman Empire ever reached was the British Islands, but they never got quite as far north as Scotland. They couldn't quite get a good foothold up there. And along that border, then, for protection was built Hadrian's Wall. There were other walls like this that were built in other places for protection of the empire. Hadrian's Wall is one that survives in pretty decent shape. And as you can see, it was long, right? It goes for a good, I think 70 some odd miles across the British Island, right here, cutting a swath between what is now England and Scotland. Hadrian's Wall marks the northernmost point that the Roman Empire ever reached. Its influence never got quite any further north than that. And it survives in ruins. It was at some point it was much taller than it is now. I think I read in some cases it was 40 feet tall in places. Right? So you imagine that, a 40-foot tall wall that goes on for 70 miles. Right? This was again built for protection, perhaps built also just as a show of strength. Right? You want to show those people who are living north of that wall what they're up against should they ever decide they want to attack. And so at certain strategic points along the wall, there would have been these fortifications that would have been built into it, right, where soldiers would have been stationed in these places. Again, this wouldn't have been so short. This is just what remains of it. This would have been much taller, quite possibly 2 or 3 stories tall, in fact. And soldiers would have been housed in here. It would have been a place for signaling attacks and things of that nature. Another thing that the Romans built very often were triumphant arches. This is the Arch of Titus in Rome. There are many of these all throughout Europe, all throughout the areas that were conquered by and ruled by the Roman Empire. A triumphant arch would be an arch, as you can see, it would be built as an honorific to celebrate a particular victory or something in particular that an emperor may have done. This meant to commemorate Emperor Titus. But these would be built and inscriptions would be put on them to mark historic occasions and things of that nature. Like this one here that we can see, this is on the inside of the Arch of Titus. Relief sculpture, I refer you back to our lecture on ancient Greek art. There would be these relief sculptures that would be showcasing the things that telling the stories of the things that happened that are meant to showcase the power of the Roman Empire or of the particular emperor at the time. And here we see people who seem to be bringing back the spoils of war. Specifically, we see this menorah back here and other things that seem to be specifically of Hebrew and Jewish origin. That's because this is meant to showcase and commemorate the sacking of Jerusalem and the final defeat of the Hebrews and the Jews who stood up and fought against the Roman Empire. Right? And there's a procession here because the triumphant arch would have been set up as the final destination of a marching parade that would come into a town to having returned from whatever. Right? Then we're just going to briefly look at paintings and mosaics. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because we have very few Roman paintings that have survived. Most of them are frescoes. We know they painted on other things, but those things just didn't survive the millennia that have gone by since. And the mosaics we'll talk about momentarily. Again, they borrowed heavily from what the Greeks had done before them. This is a wall painting, a fresco, again, in what is called the Villa of Livia, painted somewhere around 20 BCE. And looking at it, it gives us the indication that the painters of ancient Rome were very concerned with naturalism. Again, not unlike they were in the sculpture. They wanted things to look very observational. They wanted them to look true to life, and you can see them studying botany, studying the anatomy of animals in order to get the birds and things correct, right? They want these things to look correct. However, what they hadn't quite developed was a sense of three-dimensional perspective. Right? They hadn't yet quite developed a way of creating a sense where the flatness of the painting is given the illusion of actually having depth that one could step into. And so the kind of the best that they've accomplished here is, and it's better than anything that we saw in, say, the Egyptian paintings, and it's better than what we see in a lot of the Greek painting as well, at least with what survives. What they did was stack things in such a way that things that are further away are higher, and things that are closer to us are lower. So that this fence here that's meant to be closer to us is down here, right? There's some space in between it and this fence here, which is maybe further away from us. The tree right here that's on a similar level as the fence is lower than the trees that are beyond it, that are further away and ergo are higher up. That seems to be what the Romans developed for their paintings. Now, mosaics, those we have a lot of. We have a lot of mosaics that have survived from the ancient Romans. A mosaic is done by putting down a layer of wet concrete, sometimes wet plaster, but with the Romans it was usually wet concrete, and having lots of little tiny stones that were different colors that you would press into that wet concrete to create an image. And then once the concrete cures, you have an image that's fully formed. So that we look at this image here, this love scene mosaic, you'll notice that everything's made up of little tiny small bits of colored rock, right, to create this image. Now, one thing that that the Romans are really innovating here is using mosaic to give a sense of the form of the people, the bed, what have you, by really playing around with hard-edged shapes of where the light and the shadow are. For instance, if we look at, say, this woman's arm here, right? We have pebbles of one color, a very light color, that represent where the light is hitting the arm, and then a whole set of darker pebbles here that represent the shadow, with not a whole lot of, say, a gradient in between. It's pretty much just like, here's a shape of light, here's a shape of shadow. Here's a shape of light, here's a shape of shadow. The bed, here's a shape of light and a shape of shadow, right? And that's doing its job nicely, right? Because it gives us an illusionistic sense of these objects, these people and objects, existing as three-dimensional forms that we could actually reach out and touch them and our hands would have something to hold onto. And it's because of the modeling of light to shadow. Hard-edged modeling, yes, but modeling nonetheless. That seems to be a Roman innovation, and we're going to see it come back again way on down the line when we get to the Renaissance. So keep in mind what I was just talking about there. Okay, I know that was a ton of information. I'm going to edit this video down a bit because I had lots of interruptions for some reason today. So that, hopefully this will be a little bit more of a manageable experience for you. Anyway, all right, that's Roman art and architecture in a nutshell. There's a whole lot I could have talked about and covered that I didn't, but we hit some very important points. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good week. Bye-bye.